Welcome to Friday night's video and our second master series. I do believe this is the 65th video in our second master series, the 14th video on our basic processors, and the first video on reverberation effects and spatialization effects. So first of all, the biggest thing that I want to get across first and foremost when we're dealing with reverberation is a couple different things. The first thing is we're going to take a look at a couple of different ways we use reverberation for spatialization and bodybuilding. These are two separate areas that we talked about in my first master series, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The second thing we want to talk about with reverberation, as well as when we were dealing with equalization, trying to cut out frequency and impulse responses, frequency response and trying to control that, is we want to control that whenever we are dealing with spatialization, reverberation, and bodybuilding, because your room and whatever your capture, when you're capturing, that can conflict with whatever spatialization work you're doing with reverberation effects. So you really want to control that. Myself, that I'm very much on the standpoint of isolating things away to have as little effect from the room as possible, and then I add where I put the production where I want it. If I want it in a small jazz cafe, or I want it in a small auditorium, or a big concert hall, or the Taj Mahal, that I'll deal with that later. I want the capture itself. There are situations where you got a chance to go to this big, really nice studio that's got this beautiful room, that it's spent a lot of money and had acousticians come in there and really spend the time sculpting that room so it just sounds beautiful. But that's not always true for every application. You cannot put every production in that room. You will have problems. It just doesn't work. So that is my opinion. So, we've talked about the opinion. Now, if you cut it out as much as possible and worry about getting as clean a capture as possible, you will become a much better audio engineer at putting it in whatever place you want to. So this is a huge concept that, in my humble opinion, is one of the first things you need to get through your head, becoming that next level master audio engineers. Get good clean captures that are not as affected by the room, and who are affected by them as little as possible, and focus on putting them where you want them with things like convolution reverb. So, and that is the next thing I want to talk about. Is convolution reverb is the gun of choice. You can put different impulse responses in there, cabinet responses, spring reverbs, plate reverb responses, just about any kind of reverberation you want. Learn how to use that one tool that you have as well as possible and master it. Now, every now and then you might do something funky and pull out some other reverb or something like that and do something off the wall, but master those. You can probably do, if you want to do something funky, you'll be able to do something funky with it if you want. So that is my other suggestion, because when I pull out my reverbs, I was like, even in my DAW, I've got these three reverbs come stock in my DAW. There's a little mix verb, there's a room reverb, and there's an open air convolution reverb. All three of these reverbs are pretty good, and they do a pretty good job if I use them well. I know there are limitations. I test them, like we talked about when we were talking about our reverb, our equalization, testing them thoroughly. And my room reverb is actually pretty good. And, my open air, my convolution reverb does a great job. It is an awesome tool. But I definitely recommend, gun of choice, pick the convolution reverb, pick which one you're going to be working with, and then master using it in all your applications. Anytime you want to do something different, you want to experiment with other ones, great. But master the one you have, master your convolution reverb. That is going to take you to that next level as a master audio engineer. This is the gun of choice to use if you're going to become that next level master audio engineer. I guarantee you that. That's my opinion, but I'm going to stand behind it. So the next thing we want to talk about is we get into reverberation itself. So, reverberation itself, we talked about, we want to get as clean a captures as possible and try to limit any input from the room. Unless we're really trying to capture some specific room, I want a bathroom effect, so I record in the bathroom or in some hall, or it's this really nice studio that has this really great sound. You can find that if you spend your time getting as clean a captures as possible and then focus on investigating different types of impulse responses with different frequency responses and things like that, cleaning them up, that you will come out with much better, cleaner productions that you are much happier with. Because reverberations, you have a direct sound, then it shoots out all over the place in every direction, and then that comes back. You get early reflections. The reverberation is bouncing off all over the place. The sound source happens, it starts hitting all over the place, bouncing back at you. The first thing that's going to hit you is the direct sound, then you start getting all these reflections that come back. And it's a pretty simple, situation to understand. We've talked about this in the first Master Series. Got that direct sound. It's the first thing to hit you. Then you start getting early reflections. Then you start getting later reflections until they muddle out. And we talked about reverberation a lot, that the materials in the room are going to affect the frequency response, which is going to it's going to sound like it's affecting the impulse response, which sometimes it's not exactly, but it's really hard to separate them besides pulling out an equalizer and affecting it in process or affecting the impulse responses. There's some videos on my channel about, working there's before the first Master Series started, there's a section on C50 clarity guides and how to work your impulse responses to make them shorter, to clean things up, and actually re-equalize them to control the frequency response content. So I suggest you go back and watch those. That is very pertinent. So we understand basically what we're dealing with, the fundamental concept of what's happening there, and things like the RT60. You're going to want to read about that a little bit, how fast things die off, and this whole concept has a direct relation, besides just trying to clean things up in your room, trying to limit, effect of your room on it so that you get as clean a capture as possible. That also, when we're talking about the C50 clarity guides and useful reflections, up to like 50 milliseconds, and that's debatable because you've got useful reflections up to about 50 milliseconds, depending on whether you're dealing with narration or music. It's a little different. And then the rest of it's detrimental reflections. It just causes mud. But they can be honed. You can take actual impulse responses. I've got a large hall here. I've cut it down to 50 milliseconds. I've cut it down to 40 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, 20 milliseconds, and 10 milliseconds to put in my convolution reverb to have the effect and sound of that big hall, but cut down to very quick instances of it so that I can really reduce mud in places I don't need it for an effect. Like an out front vocal, I might have it on 50 milliseconds, or I might leave that large hall on there to give it this cathedral effect on this large hall. But everything else is going to get that same reverb, but cut down so that it reduces mud in the mix. Just a simple, example. So, we're talking about, we're looking at an oscilloscope and we've got just like even a drum hit here, and then we've added light reverb to it. We've added heavier reverb to it, or, really heavy reverb to it, that it's cumulative, and it starts to cause messes. When things are out front or you're trying to use it for an effect, that's great. But otherwise, reverb is to really help, put things in a space. So they all sound like they're in the same space, to lesser and more degrees to try to balance the mix without getting it muddy. So I always go back to, go light, especially with reverb. It's a powerful tool, but if you use it too much, it's like too much salt in your soup. You've got like, Lowry seasoning salt that you just really love, and you put a little bit in your soup and it's just like, yeah, dude. But you add just too much and it's like, Yeah, yuck, throw it in the garbage. You know what I'm saying? It's a wonderful thing, but you add too much of it and it just makes everything garbage. You've got a beautiful soup that you've just ruined with too much Lowry seasoning salt. So, and reverb is one of the biggest tools of your meat and potato tools, your most important guns you have. That's a guilty thing. A lot of times when I see people not really being able to use the reverb well, I'm like, a rule of thumb, go light. And a lot of times, if you can hear it and you hear reverb, back off until you can't really hear it. And then AB it back and forth, on and off, bypass it, and come back, because it doesn't take much when it all mixed in to add spatialization to it, body, and give it some kind of presence as like it's in some space, or that all the tracks were done in one specific space, and add that effect to it. But sometimes you listen to your favorite songs and you can't really tell, it's like, don't you love the reverb amount on there? And you go, I don't really hear reverb. Yeah, no doubt, dude. But if I took it off there, you'd know there wasn't. You'd know I took it off, I guarantee you. That is a huge lesson learned with reverberation spatialization. And we'll talk about bodybuilding later, but that's a whole different monster. Audio diffraction, when you're dealing with, responses from cabinets, when we're talking about amplifiers and amp sims and things like that. All these things are going to affect the sound of your reverberation and how it affects the whole. And also, being consistent. It's like if I choose a certain impulse response, like I'm going to choose this impulse response. I'm going to use that impulse response on all of my tracks with this open air reverb in lesser degrees and in more degrees and things like that. And I might, does that make sense? So that they don't conflict against each other. A bunch of different reverberation applications across a big mix causes mud. They start conflicting against each other, have different sounds, different frequency responses, different impulse responses, different tails, different early reflections, late reflections, that can cause mud to where you're just like going, well, I thought I was doing a good job on it and I got this mix here and it just sounds like crap. It's just messy. It doesn't have this nice clean sound, but reverberated and da-da-da. My stuff doesn't sound like, Whitney Houston, done at MGM, I don't know what's going on. Does that make sense? Because you've made a muddy mess out of things instead of being, we talked about that in the first master series when we were dealing with reverberations. When we were processing, I suggest you go back and watch that. But we're going to get into a little bit more detail here in the second master series and actually talk about the reverb equipment and processors itself to help take you to that next level as a master audio engineer, and where I think, in my opinion, where you need to focus on. And even if your opinion is a little bit different, that like I talked about when we were talking about equalization, that you focus on those areas I'm telling you to help take you to that next level master audio engineer. But you may utilize them a little differently. So the last short segment on equalization should have made that real clear as we go through these basic processors of how your opinion of how to apply the concepts and what I'm trying to show you is a huge hurdle you have to get over and start to get comfortable with your opinion and understanding it's going to probably change, it's probably going to get better, and it's probably going to evolve as you become a better and better audio engineer with perfecting your usage, your understanding, and your opinion and how you apply these things. So these are the areas that we're going to focus in, and this is kind of an intro to the reverberation and the reverberation effects. And what we're going to be mostly talking about, and we'll get out some analysis tools and take a look about what's happening. But for the most part, that just getting a little bit deeper so that you understand, you choose a gun. And I'm telling you, in my opinion, to choose your convolution reverb. You can experiment with other type of room reverbs, plate reverbs, spring reverbs, other little mixed verbs or, reverberation tools or some wild ones that you get on the internet. I have no problem with that, but master your big gun. Master your big gun, master it, and understand it inside and out and become a master audio engineering, using it, mastering it as a meat and potatoes tool, and then mastering what its possibilities are. So I certainly hope you enjoyed this introduction video to our reverberation spatialization section in the second master series on our basic processors, and I will see you in the next video when we get started with our reverberation processors.